Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I am joined again by Keith Preston, Terminal Philosophy, and Swithun Dobson. We're here to sort of discuss the sort of evolution in Hoppe's thought and his influence not only in the libertarian movement, but his influence on the rise of the alternative right. So if we look at Hoppe's thought, we can divide it into roughly three categories. There's what we might say that the pure libertarian theory category, which culminates in his work on argumentation ethics. And for a libertarian who's a left, right, or plumb line, that Hoppe is universally accessible. It's not like anyone would say, well, we can't read that because that's politically incorrect. That kind of Hoppe is universally accessible to anybody within the libertarian family. Second of all, Hoppe, beginning in 2001 with Democracy of the God That Failed, takes a strong stance in favor of right libertarianism. And for about 10 to 15 years, that leads to a huge signal boost to right libertarianism. And then right around the time the alternative right gets started, around 2012, 2013, we have two elements developing from this right-wing libertarian Hoppean thought. One is neo-reaction with Curtis Yarvin, who states explicitly that he was inspired by Hoppe in many regards. And then also the libertarian alt-right pipeline, where a lot of right-wing Hoppean libertarians embraced a more alt-right, maybe more ethno-nationalist argument. They certainly popularized the meme forcible removal with helicopters, which of course they got from Democracy of the God That Failed. So we'll throw this to our resident libertarian, Swithun. Why don't you explain this first period of Hoppe's thought and influence in a purely theoretical libertarian framework?
Well, what you have to remember with Hoppe is his primary education, as it was, it seems to be in philosophy more than economics. He comes to economics relatively late. And historically, he was actually a Marxist before he became a libertarian. And he's very influenced by Immanuel Kant. He takes the view, following David Hume, that the is-ought dichotomy is unbridgeable. And so there are no value-laden facts in that view. So what he attempts to do is to, in his very German manner, is to effectively create an impossibility theorem which puts libertarian ethics on the most solid foundations possible. And he develops his argumentational ethics similar to Habermas, who I believe was his PhD professor or to do his habilitation. I can't remember which. And so the basic premise is of Hoppe's argumentational ethics, which is sort of finalized in its sort of most mature form in a theory of socialism and capitalism, which was released in 1988. It essentially goes like this. To figure out whether any arguments are true or false, you effectively have to engage in argumentation. And so he takes this as like a ground norm that argumentation is sort of necessary. And so to engage in argumentation, you must have various presuppositions to follow it through logically. One of which is it is a sort of a peaceful exercise. It's in a sense a non-violent one, and to take place, it requires that we both recognize that I have ownership of my vocal cords and my body, and you have rights to your vocal cords and your body. Otherwise, any argumentation could not take place. Consequently, he says, well, to be logically consistent, if you accept the ownership of your own body as sort of absolute, then you cannot then argue for any infringements on any property rights that are accessed in a sort of Lockean or neo-Lockean manner, because ultimately that would be self-refuting, because it would be undermining the basis on which argumentation takes place. And so in his phrase, you engage in a performative contradiction. This is also, at the time, he writes quite a lot on economic methodology, which is actually related in a way to his sort of ethical approach. That is, he had one essay, he had one article which was against Donald. He was Donald then, Donald McCloskey, which was called, I think, In Defense of Extreme A Priorism. So this gives you a flavor of his kind of his general approach. So that's how the argument is kind of constructed. It's an impossibility theorem. It's not to say that libertarianism is ethical and correct in a certain sense, merely that it's the only justifiable position that you can hold. That's the way he approaches it, and this is what Kinsella later, who very much pretty much agrees with argumentational ethics, says, well, it's not really right in any sort of moral sense. It's the only thing that can be logically justifiable, and this is consistent with the very strict separation of sort of fact and value, which Hoppe takes to be sort of axiomatic to that. So when this came out, it was controversial. Murray Rothbard was a huge fan. Just remember that Hoppe works with Rothbard. Rothbard gets him to go and work with him in Las Vegas to start sort of like the new Austrian circle, as it were, there, which kind of disappears after Rothbard dies in 95. So it was controversial at the time. I'm pretty sure there was lots of writing, sort of the Journal of Libertarian Studies. Later writers such as Bob Murphy have argued against it with Gene Callahan. Roderick Long is reasonably well disposed towards it, but he isn't fully on board. Some of the more empirically minded libertarians, who more beltway ones, just thought, oh, well, this is just these crazy fringe people doing crazy fringe stuff again. So it has some reasonable influence. It's still debated in sort of the Mises libertarian circles. But yeah, I haven't really seen any huge debates about it relatively recently. And so it's kind of just disappeared a little bit, I think, at least when it comes to sort of defense of the libertarian position. So that would be, I think, a broad overview of the style of argument and the way it was received at the time.
Okay, so yeah, Keith, what are sort of your thoughts or assessments of this period of Hoppe's work and thought?
Well, I remember when I first heard of Hans Hermann Hoppe, I remember reading an essay that he wrote where he was explaining his theory of argumentation ethics. And as a moral skeptic, I tended to have the same reaction to it that I have to any writing that advocates for some sort of moral theory, and that is, well, so what, But the problem that I had with it is that on one hand, there is this idea that we arrive at factual conclusions, or we discover truth or whatever, that's endemic in the Western tradition that goes all the way back to the Socratic method, and you have that in the Enlightenment and classical liberalism, and the theory behind free speech, the idea that through open debate you can you compare ideas and reach factual conclusions that way, or sort of a philosopher's approach to the scientific method. So I understand the concept. But to take that and say that, well, this means that this process legitimizes my particular version of libertarianism, always just struck me as sort of a reach. There have been plenty of thinkers historically that have embraced the Socratic method and the things that can be derived from that, but certainly don't embrace libertarianism. In fact, it seems to be something you could use to defend a kind of majoritarian democracy with the open process of debate, and then you sort of take a vote on, okay, who do you think has the best arguments, and then we reach some kind of policy conclusion or legislation through that, more the conventional democratic theory rather than libertarianism per se. So it's the argumentation ethics idea isn't something that I'm really personally that up on, but I just recall being very unimpressed with it.
Yeah, terminal philosophy. So your thought on this period of Hoppe's work?
Right. Well, Hoppe's popularity in modern libertarian circles should not be understated. I mean, much of his work has been translated into something like 30 languages, and of course, he often speaks at academic conferences and so forth. Many other libertarian writers hold him in pretty high regard, or at least write a lot in reaction to his work. A lot of individuals like Lou Rockwell, David Gordon, Sam Francis, and Thomas Fleming, and also the Tom Woods Show, are all either in favor of his work or react against certain aspects of him. Swithun was right earlier when he said that, well, in the sense that much of his academic training began with philosophy. Hoppe had developed this reputation where he adheres rigorously to logic, which sort of culminated in his support for something called praxeology, which we can get into in a moment. But that's sort of what I've always understood his philosophical beginnings and sort of operational backdrop to be. The only real the work that I'm familiar with is Hans Hermann Hoppe is his 2001 book Democracy, The God That Failed, and also The Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. But you were right in your initial statements, Todd, when you talked about this sort of almost universally accessible libertarianism, where Hoppe really didn't make a huge controversial splash. Of course, that wouldn't come until 2001 when he released Democracy, The God That Failed. And really his work in that area is interesting too, in that it's sort of democracy is a failure because it sort of legitimizes the state, and that it's fundamentally incompatible with human liberty. Neo-reactionaries, as I'm sure we'll talk about, seem to like Hoppe's idea of sort of this covenant community, which again was brought about with Curtis Yarvin or Mencius Mollbug. I'll just keep my opening statement to that.
Yeah. Now, I guess what I'll add to about my thoughts on this period of Hoppe is I think the problem with the construction of argumentation ethics is best exemplified by it's a thread that's now long gone, because I think Mises Institute redid all of its commenting rules, so all the old comments were wiped out in favor of this new system. But there was a long thread of discussion about Kinsilla's theory on intellectual property. And Kinsilla was arguing that this is the only in principle way that you could ever solve these problems. And another fellow Mises member, David Gordon, was like, well, no, Kinsilla, you're wrong. I mean, there are other internally consistent methods that if people agreed to could be useful, could just as adequately resolve disputes. And there was this long shouting match, I guess, where Kinsilla was like saying, no, David, you don't get it. It's the only way. And I'm like, he's like, well, no, it's only one way that you could do it. And you haven't demonstrated that any of the other ways are wrong or should be discarded. And I think that kind of thinking is exemplified in argumentation ethics. It didn't exactly come up, but in my debate with Walter Block, he was basically arguing that this is the only consistent way you could have some sort of moral intuition, some sort of libertarian theory. And I'm like, well, I mean, it may be internally consistent to itself, but it doesn't follow, therefore, that there is not some other internally consistent theory that could account for the same moral intuition. And then how would we solve that dispute? Well, that's another question entirely. But I think that tended to be the weakness with argumentation ethics. It's maybe not so much the argument itself, though there might be faults there, as Bob Murphy seems to think, but it's the way the question is even asked in the first place. Now, shifting to the second phase of where Hoppe really gets well known is his critique of democracy, Democracy, the God That Failed. And also around this time, I think he got in trouble with what the ACLU for saying statements that were construed as being anti-homosexual. And a lot of libertarians were like, yeah, he's basically a Nazi right now. And that was sort of coincided. And the argument that he made was based on time preference, which was, of course, the central element of his argument in Democracy of the God That Failed. So they are linked together as a part of this evolution of Hoppean thought. And the question is, was Hoppe always like this? Maybe, maybe not. But it does seem that it does evolve from his sort of deontological first principles. And that kind of thinking tends to be more common amongst right libertarians anyhow. While left libertarians or even plumb-line libertarians might not object in principle to this kind of argumentation of Hoppe, they don't necessarily use that as their opener, right? They would use something else. Someone who's more of a right-leaning libertarian would use it as an opener. So, Swithun, why don't you sort of sketch out Hoppe's bombshell with Democracy of the God That Failed?
Just to begin with, this I'm pretty sure has always been Hoppe, at least since the mid to late 1980s, because prior to this work, he was, because he was involved with Murray Rothbard, he was involved indirectly then with the Rothbard-Rockwell crowd from the early 90s, where Rothbard goes sort of paleo-lib as his new audience to bring the gospel of anarcho-capitalism as opposed to the left, as he'd done in the 1960s and early 1970s. Because he makes a speech, which basically, Hoppe makes a speech, I think it's after Rothbard dies, in about 96, maybe 97, in which he offends all the paleocons, saying that they simply don't understand economics, and this is going to be your big downfall. And he annoys Sam Francis significantly at this time, I think, if I remember correctly. So I'm pretty sure that the Hoppe from Democracy of the God That Failed has been Hoppe for quite a long time. I think certainly since the late 1980s. So what is his main premise in Democracy of the God That Failed? Well, essentially this. If you have someone who owns a piece of property, they are interested. Well, if you have a monarch who considers the whole realm his own private property, assuming the goal of the said monarch is to basically increase his monetary income, what he will do is he will engage in policies which maximize his revenues over the long run, because he's going to be king forever, and he can pass it on to his son. This is in the context of sort of absolute monarchy, hereditary and absolute monarchy of the 18th century. So your probably best example here would be someone like Louis XIV, probably the archetypal Hoppean monarch in that sense. And the idea is he is going to be in there for increasing sort of the capital values of the realm over time, so he can maximize his tax take. In contrast to the democratic leader, the president, he has the same goals as the monarch, to basically get as much stuff as he can, as soon as he can. Well, not necessarily as soon as he can. As much stuff as he can in regards to his income and prestige and power, but he's only there for a small amount of time. And plus, he doesn't own anything. He's merely a caretaker. He's like a renter of a car. He basically uses and abuses the realm as much as he can to get as much power and influence as he can. He doesn't really care about what happens to the capital values in the future, because he doesn't own them, so he can't sell them. And he can't pass it on to his son because, well, democracy is not supposed to work that way. Plus, once you have a whole group of people who can vote, they're going to vote on the grounds of redistributing themselves money. So an interesting thing, it shows the sort of Marxist element in a certain sense to Hoppe. He has a paper in the mid-90s, I think it is, or no, this is the early 90s, which is Austrian and Marxist class analysis, in which he basically makes the case that it's the state that's the exploiter as opposed to the capitalist. But what you do when you're in democracy is you have free entry to the state to exploit others as you see fit, and democracy is a great way of doing this. Because everyone can exploit everybody else easily, and everybody thinks that they have a part in the government. So they're not really exploiting anybody individually. Who is the state and who is the government is sort of muddied in democracy. So you lose this sort of this class interest of the oppressed group by the state, which you don't in the case of monarchy, because, well, it's the king. We know the king's a bad guy, but he's the king and we're not. So there's much more resistance to what the king does, especially if you have nobles and things who can resist in sort of more reasonable ways, typically if you had their own private armies, which of course you don't have in democracy. So on this basis, effectively then, he argues that monarchy is superior to democracy and uses various empirical arguments to make that case. And Hoppe never uses empirical arguments. He uses empirical illustrations, because he would say the argument is independent of the illustrations he uses. So he compares, say, the 19th century, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Vienna, and compares it with post-1918 Europe, which is really the start of the democratic age. So this on its own annoys all the classical liberals who see the great progression from monarchy to sort of liberal democracy as like an advance. So they get annoyed at him on that basis. They do that. They also, related to this as well, in Democracy, the God That Fails, he has his infamous or famous chapter, depending how you want to approach it, why libertarians should be conservatives and why conservatives should be libertarians, in which he advocates covenant communities, to which most famously has physical removal for communist agitators and homosexual agitators. That's his sort of most famous, infamous line. Because this version of Hoppe says, look, plumliners, you are not right. You can't just have libertarian ethics stand in a vacuum. What we need is a broader cultural basis on which to propagate these values. And that is sort of like a family-based, sort of relative, sort of socially conservative society. And so what you would need to do is you would create these sort of restricted covenant agreements. And what you basically say is, if anybody is advocating against the order, so as he says, like, so I think when he says communists and like homosexual advocates, I think what he primarily has in mind is people who are actively agitating for communism and sort of recruiting and trying to sort of subvert the community, and sort of homosexual advocates who aren't just necessarily homosexual, but ones who are saying, marriage is terrible, we should abolish it, it is oppressive, etc., etc. I think it's those sorts of people he has in mind, as opposed to just the guy in the closet. I think you probably just leave him alone to a large extent. And then obviously this is hugely incendiary to whole hosts of sort of libertarians who are in it for the anti-authoritarianism. And related to this, along with the monarchism, it would give fuel to the fire of sort of Chomsky's view that libertarianism is just sort of private tyranny. So this sort of fans the flames everywhere. And related to this, as you pointed out, at Nevada in Las Vegas, he had always historically used arguments that homosexuals had higher time preferences. That is, they weren't in it for the long run. And that's one of the major things I didn't say with respect to monarchy and democracy. The monarch has a lower time preference. He doesn't want things now. He can defer gratification because he can maximize it over the time he's monarch, which you can't do as a president because you're only there for 4 years, or you're prime minister under 10 years typically. So you have a higher time preference. You want to sort of get the stuff now. And his argument was, well, homosexuals typically have higher time preferences because they have no children. So they have no reason to create a great amount of assets in their middle to old age to bequeath to their children because they don't have any, which then annoyed one young homosexual there who then tried to get him fired, and there was a whole big hoo-ha there, but eventually he was reinstated. But I think shortly thereafter he had enough of that and then went to live in Turkey. So That's the sort of early 2000s Hoppe and the sort of controversies that took place there.
Yeah. Now, Keith, you had some choice words for Hoppe in this regard. You wrote in 2002. He then goes on to say that the advocates of alternative, non-family, kin-centered lifestyles, such as, for instance, individual hedonism, parasitism, nature, environment, worship, homosexuality, or communism, will have to be physically removed from society, too, if one is to maintain a libertarian order. What is this? Anarcho Stalinism? One could easily imagine comparable rhetoric spewing from the pages of Pravda circa 1938. So you've had some developing thoughts on Hoppe. At first, you were a little more sympathetic. You sort of thought he was more revolutionary, like a lot of the early libertarian consensus. But then you kind of gradually soured on Hoppe. And this is right around that time when Hoppe rolls out Democracy of the God That Failed. So why don't you explain some of your thoughts on Hoppe in this period?
Yes, I know more about this aspect of Hoppe's work than I do the argumentation ethics. That I never paid much attention to. But when I remember when Democracy, the God That Failed first appeared, probably around 20 years ago, I actually wrote a review of it that was picked up by the LouRockwell.com website. And I praised that book quite a bit. And what I liked about it at the time was that I had always, for all of my life, heard all of these arguments from people with mainstream views about how modern democracy is such an awesome system and the best there ever was. And I was always interested in points of view that actually criticized modern democracy and pointed out its weaknesses. And, I was familiar with the classical anarchists and people like that, of course, and then Lysander Spooner's critique of the Constitution. But I thought Hoppe's work was really interesting because he seemed to have this really elaborate theoretical system that had a very comprehensive critique of modern democracy. And basically, he just rejected it across the board, which I thought from an anarchist perspective was interesting and helpful. Now, today, I would say that Hoppe's work was not nearly as original as I thought it was at the time. At the time, I wasn't really that familiar with the European anti-democratic tradition. Since then, I've become much more familiar with thinkers that precede Hoppe, like, say, Eric von Kuehnelt-Leddihn and Eric Vogelin, and the whole spectrum of the anti-modernist right, or the throne and altar tradition, or the revolutionary right. In fact, I ended up writing a book of my own outlining the ideas of some of these thinkers, a book called Thinkers Against Modernity. So I don't really see him as nearly as original as I once did. Now I see him being, more in the vein of this kind of wider European anti-modernist tradition, at least when it comes to this aspect of his thinking, not every aspect of his thinking. So when I read his book, The Democracy, the God That Failed, I remember I really liked the critique of democracy. I was like, yeah, he's really slamming modern democracy to the wall here. As far as the part that he wrote about cultural conservatism, I remember writing a critique of that aspect of his thinking that this was back when I was first starting to get published on other websites other than my own. And that critique of his cultural conservatism, I know, was published on antistate.com, which was Jeremy Sapienza's old site. It may have been published on Rockwell as well. I'm not sure about that. But yeah, when I read that chapter, I thought, well, this does sound kind of like the Stalinist rhetoric you hear about the rootless cosmopolitans and parasitical, whatevers, because I had actually seen language like that in Stalinist real Stalinist publications before. So I did think that was an interesting comparison. But it's also ironic, though, because I really took Hoppe to task over his cultural conservatism in that piece. In fact, I remember there was some fellow who wrote a rebuttal to my piece and arguing in favor of something like Hoppe's views. And then I wrote a reply to that as well. I think I called it "Why I'm Still Not a Cultural Conservative" or something of that lines. But what I was arguing for, though, against Hoppe was not so much for the standard cultural leftist paradigm. I do have writing that I've produced before where I critique conventional conservatives and even conventional right libertarians. And I say that there are holes in both cultural or traditional conservatism, and there are holes in this kind of fusionist, kind of libertarian conservative hybrid, I think, on a theoretical level as well as on a practical level. But my perspective on the cultural stuff, at least for the last, I'd say 25 years, has been that minus the state and minus the centralization of economic and political and cultural and technological and military power, which as a broad anarchist, I tend to criticize all of that. On the cultural questions, I think what you would find in the absence of concentrated power would not so much be cultural conservatism of the more traditional kind that Hoppe advocates, which although there might be pockets of that, nor would it be this kind of woke, cultural leftism that the Center for a Stateless Society and the left anarchists and even some of the Beltway libertarians, there's a whole spectrum of libertarians that more or less have that kind of cultural paradigm that, well, libertarianism is really just about gay rights and feminism and multiculturalism and all these kind of, it's based, I once wrote a critique of that point of view. I called it cultural leftism minus the state or something like that. So I've actually over the years criticized both left and right libertarians on these cultural questions, because my perspective is more in the vein of minus concentrated power, you would see the proliferation of a much wider plethora of cultural norms or microcultures, some of which would not be culturally conservative in the traditional sense or culturally leftist in the conventional sense either. For example, I think that one of the effects of the state is to centralize control over resources, and the centralization of control over resources implies centralization of control over culture. And that's why on the worldwide basis now you start to see this American cultural imperialism. I'm a social scientist, and a few years ago there was a study done in the social sciences, not by me, but by others, where around the world they would show people in all these different countries, and including some fairly remote places, a collection of symbols. Like, what does this symbol mean? What does that symbol mean? What they found was that the McDonald's golden arches was the world's most widely recognized symbol, even more so than either the Christian cross or the Islamic crescent. So McDonald's is more famous than either Christianity or Islam, the two, the world's two largest religions. So I think that is the result of cultural imperialism, which is a result of centralization of military, political, and economic and cultural power. Now, what I think cultural libertarianism would look like would be, broadly speaking, what it looked like in the era before the rise of modern states and modern empires. If you look at what the world was like before, say, the era of colonialism, if you even in Europe, if you turn back the clock to the pre-Roman era, if you look at all the traditional indigenous cultures of Europe, of Africa, of Central Asia, across the whole Eurasian landmass of East Asia, the Pacific, the Western Hemisphere, you see that there were literally thousands upon thousands of cultures with all kinds of widely varying norms and perspectives and ideas that were barely even recognizable when compared to each other. A lot of these traditional cultures from different parts of the world, they may as well have been different species or different planets or something like that. So that tends to be my perspective on cultural politics and the relationship between institutions and culture. Minus concentrated power trying to impose a cultural model on everything, you get this plethora of cultures where ultimately you have as much diversity as what you see in the creature cantina scene in Star Wars. It's where it's and I'm not talking about multiculturalism in the left, the conventional leftist sense. What therefore is actually a kind of ideological uniformity but we have a diversity of skin colors. It's kind of like the U.S. Army, where they're all about having races and genders and sexual diversity in the Army, but everybody still wears the Army uniform. And that's my perspective on cultural questions is more the opposite of that. You would have minus concentrated power, huge numbers of microcultures, some of which may be very conservative and very disagreeable to our modern leftist friends. Some of it might be points of view and practices that our conservative friends may find abhorrent as well, and everything in between, even normies. That's where I would disagree with Hoppe.
All right, terminal philosophy. What are your thoughts on this period of Hoppe's influence?
Right. Well, I will say that in regards to his later era of his work, that Tom Woods offered a good defense of his 2001 book, Democracy and the God That Failed, in that he rejects this idea that Hoppe is some sort of authoritarian or racist because of this sort of controversy about his discussion of time preference about gay people and couples without children. Instead, Woods points out that Hoppe's model is really centered around this idea of the covenant community, not a universal and ubiquitously applied level of authority like something like under Stalin or modern North Korea. Since the operational unit of this model is really the community, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary, according to Hoppe, to come across a community or to come across a town or city that says something like, no Germans or no Zulus or English or et cetera, et cetera. I agree with you, Swithun, in that Hoppe always did believe these so-called more controversial views about democracy. In lectures and essays before 2001, he had been quite consistent in his disdain for democracy. It's more that Democracy, the God That Failed, ended up being a collection of essays that he sort of compiled and created more of a logical and consistent narrative. It seems that Hoppe is aware of this sort of cyclical historical pattern where democracy will come about and be popular on this sort of populistic level, and then eventually devolve into a mob rule kind of entity, and then something more traditional, monarchical or authoritarian in nature will take its place. He seems to be well aware of this pattern, and it sort of almost echoes the Platonic or Aristotelian criticisms of democracy. There is, of course, his famous allegory or analogy of the homeowner versus the temporary homeowner, where Swithun, you went over this quite well, so I don't know if I'll repeat it much here, but that is really sort of the kind of the central philosophical allegory of why democracies fail, because again, there's this poor treatment of the populace and for things in general if there's a temporary overseer of that type of a thing. I think Hoppe saw much of modern libertarianism and conservatism as too logically inconsistent on things like policy. For example, he had lost a lot of support from classical liberals and conservatives or the Francis Fukuyama types in his total rejection of something like a welfare state, as it imposes, according to Hoppe, this sort of this indirect form of this sort of indirect loss of individual liberty. He also lost some support from his contemporaries and some folks in the academy for his opposition to the Iraq War. He made his distance from sort of neocon normies is quite clear. I'll leave my initial comments on this era on Hoppe to that.
Yeah, so the sort of interesting takeaway that I have with this era of Hoppe is that the rhetorical strength of his arguments all tend to be based on an empirical reading of history. And he says, he wants to have this really deontological first principles justification for everything. And, we can say that, well, he didn't intend that. Well, okay, maybe. But, there was a podcast that Jeff Reckenbach did, whereas, was Lord of the Rings libertarian? And he said that, well, Tolkien might not have set out to write a libertarian work. According to Regenbach, he actually did. And so we have to judge the person not by what he intended to write, but what he actually wrote and did. And I think what ends up happening is that there is this element which we brought up earlier in another discussion, that Hoppe's methodology is kind of a more classically politically left epistemology, at least when it comes to constructing commonwealths. For example, Burke said that you build a commonwealth a posteriori, or through observation rather than through these first principles. And this sort of then gets into the third and final aspect. Now, in this regard, Hoppe is not directly present. I mean, he's still doing his property freedom society stuff, but the rise of neo-reaction, and I think he has had some neo-reactionaries. I think he's even had Richard Spencer talk at the Property Freedom Conference. And the rise of the alt-right in general has gotten a lot of it does seem to have originated from a certain group of right-wing libertarians who had a certain reading of Hoppe. So, for example, Richard Spencer said he was a libertarian at one point. A lot of these alt-right people, I think even Greg Johnson said he was a libertarian. A lot of these people went through this libertarian phase, but I think it was of a more right Hoppean libertarian phase. And then that developed into, I guess you could say, two strands, of sort of neither of which are truly libertarian at this point. Neo-reactionary thinking with Mencius Moldbug, or aka Curvis Yarvin, or a more actually alt-right ethno-nationalist position, which is the libertarian alt-right pipeline. So, Swithun, why don't you sort of sketch out how his thought evolved in this more authoritarian, not even libertarian direction?
I think when it comes to sort of the Hoppe to the alt-right, what you hear is, if you listen to a lot of sort of the alt-righters, I think even Mike Enoch, Spencer as well, I'm not sure about Greg Johnson, what they'll say is they were all Ron Paul supporters back in 2008. And then they slowly became, so they claim. Whether they were or not is another question. But then they thought they realized the problems in libertarianism, and it was kind of deracinated in certain respects. And then they sort of got on to Hoppe, because Hoppe is sort of like the halfway. Well, I suppose not the halfway house as such. He's just lots of extremes in one basket, which means you can keep sort of the Ron Paulian economics and civil liberties to some extent, but then we can also have immigration restrictionism. That's of course something that very much annoyed a lot of the left libs in 2001, because it democracy got the fail, because it showcases his arguments against immigration. He has two. One is on free trade and restricted immigration, and then something like what's it called? Immigration, private property in the natural order, or something on those lines. They're early 2000s works. And so these sort of Ron Paulian types of guys then latch onto, we can be immigration restrictionists as well and be consistent. And then they kind of move towards what you might consider more traditional sort of national, ethno-nationalist policy, which isn't just sort of somewhat immigration restrictionist. It's, well, more statist in orientation primarily. Hoppe himself effectively, I think, saw himself, at least my dates probably be a bit hazy, probably the early 2010s, as attempting to do what Rothbard and Rockwell did in the early 90s. So at the Property and Freedom Society, I think they were at the same event. Jared Taylor is there, and so is Richard Spencer. And this is a clear attempt to try to, you could say, court the sort of ethno-nationalist right, you could argue. Hoppe's position would be that, well, no. What you need to, again, back to his sort of speech, I think it's the John Randolph Club. I think it was I couldn't remember where he spoke back in the 90s. He was trying to do the same thing and trying to teach the sort of ethno-nat general rightists economics, where they can kind of help the Ortiz libertarian understand culture. And that's really what his sort of aim was. And in this time period as well, Hoppe focuses a little bit more on race. So Hoppe's argument for why the Industrial Revolution takes place in England is essentially the Cold Winter's hypothesis that you'd see from, say, Henry Harpending, which is that, well, the people were simply not intelligent enough to bring it about. And cold winters meant, and this fit in nicely with his time preference stuff, that those societies in which were agricultural societies that had harsh winters required farsightedness to survive. And so this harsh climates produces these sort of more intelligent peoples. And essentially that's part of his reason why he says that the Industrial Revolution takes place in England. And he makes this clear in his sort of theoretical anthropology he engages in, which you could argue to some extent is Marxist in approach, because in his book A Short History of Man, he attempts to explain the origin of the family and sort of private property and sort of like an a prioristic basis from sort of hunter-gatherer societies. He's not very well known, but he's actually one of his more interesting works. Isn't just a collection of his old stuff, A Short History of Man. So yeah, he goes more down the sort of racialist, sort of race realism angle, because he quotes sort of like J. Philippe Rushton and race evolution and behavior from the mid-90s. Rushton's interesting as an aside because he basically couldn't lecture in Canada for a while because everyone hated him so much. So I think he had to do it remotely even back then for some of his comments. So Hoppe would still claim that, yes, he isn't really supporting sort of Spencer or Jared Taylor, although he would be closer to Jared Taylor than he would be to Richard Spencer. Although, to be fair, Spencer's gone much further away from where he was when he went to the Property and Freedom Society. But certainly the focus on culture and the importance of culture, which Hoppe points out, and his version of that is effectively a very sort of cultural conservative, ethnic homogenous one, effectively, is one which is, of course, of appeal. And so you can see how people may jump ship with the economics a bit and then just go into sort of general sort of new rightist approaches, which I think, if I haven't read it, Michael Malice has a book on the new right, which I heard an interview on, which goes into this in some detail.
So, Keith, some of your thoughts on how Hoppe spawned new reaction in the alt-right?
Yeah, well, I was there at the very beginning of the creation of the alt-right. I think the first alt-right online publication was alternativeright.com, and I was an original staff writer. I was one of the first people that Spencer hired to be a staff writer for alt-right or alternativeright.com. So I saw all of that develop. I saw this on one hand, this kind of alt-right subculture developing, and Hoppean libertarianism was one of the tendencies or currents that fed into the development of the alt-right, along with things like Catholic traditionalism and HBD, human biodiversity, race realism, and all of that stuff. And interestingly, though, as this alt-right movement developed, you also saw libertarianism on a more general level start to improve in terms of its popularity, because you had Ron Paul running for president, and that spurred this whole interest in libertarianism, particularly among a lot of younger people. But what happened was that libertarianism started to split off into these little currents that were basically microcosms of this wider culture war that we have in the United States. So you started seeing the more conservative-leaning, right-leaning Ron Paulians getting into Hans Hermann Hoppe and getting into neo-reaction and getting into the alt-right and race realism and ethno-nationalism and becoming converts to Eastern Orthodoxy, and getting into Julius Evola and Rene Guénon and all that kind of stuff. Some pretty far out stuff. And then you saw people on the other end going in the other direction. You saw former Ron Paul fans becoming these gung-ho feminist, transgender, woke, as we would call it today, social justice warrior, whatevers. And then of course there are points of view that are kind of in between that too. And then there's varying degrees of gradation. So I think in many ways Hoppe certainly was an influence on the development of the alt-right, but he really influenced, I think, libertarianism in a much wider sense, in that a lot of left libertarianism today actually seems to be a kind of reaction against Hoppe's ideas and the kind of ideas that he helped to through which he influenced the alt-right and things like that. I know there was some left libertarian group some years ago that had an event, some kind of convention or gathering, and one of the panels at their event was something called physical removal, and all it really was like an anti-Hoppe, well, an anti-right libertarian or anti-culturally conservative libertarian or alt-right libertarian or whatever. It was anti-that, but they named it after that phrase in Hoppe's book, In Democracy, the God That Failed. So you've seen this kind of back and forth going on now for years between the Lew Rockwell crowd, the Mises Institute crowd, the paleo libertarians, and the market anarchists at C4SS, and then you've also got this Nicholson Center, which is sort of liberal libertarians, and you've got the Catoite people. And then you've got people who've renounced libertarianism altogether and just become full-on alt-rightist or ethno-nationalist or national socialist or something like that. And I think Hoppe's fingerprints are on all of that, really, because a lot of it, I think, is really derived from the influence of his work, whether for or against. I think you had some libertarians who said, "Ugh, well, we can't have this in libertarianism. We've got to be woke libertarians, and we've got to combine libertarianism with social justice." Like it's kind of the same thing happened with the libertarians that happened with the atheists. At one point, the atheists were basically Richard Dawkins types, and this kind of science nerds and all that kind of stuff. And then and then you had this influx of atheism plus. It was like well, it's not enough to just be atheist. You've got to be for gay rights and feminism and social justice and all this. And then there was sort of a reaction against that because you had the atheists that were fans of Carl Benjamin and all that kind of stuff. So libertarianism, it seems to have gone in a similar direction now, and I think that's why you have so much acrimony, from what I can tell. I've never really considered myself a part of this mainstream American type libertarianism with the Mises, Hayek, Friedman, Rand, Rothbard axis. I've always been sort of, I guess, maybe a fellow traveler to that, or maybe kind of overlapping with that a bit. But that does seem to be the direction in which all that's gone. It's kind of split off into all these different categories. So you have some libertarians who say, well, what libertarianism is really about is internet porn, whereas the other types say, no, it's really about covenant communities where we exclude transgender people or something. So it's, and I think, like I said, I think Hoppe's fingerprints are on all of that.
All right, we'll end with you, Terminal Philosophy. What are your thoughts on this latter influence of Hoppe?
Right. Well, as for this third era of Hoppe, I don't believe it's just coincidence that various people on the alt-right found some sort of intellectual ally there. I could easily be wrong about this, but much of the earlier work from Curtis Yarvin would appear to be almost straight from Hoppe's idea of the covenant community. I believe that it was appealing in the early days of the alt-right because it had the potential, on one hand, to maintain a cultural and racial homogeneity. It appeared to have an open door to things like race realism, and yet simultaneously, it also has this sort of appearance of a non-authoritarian political model that didn't have the potential for things like dissolving human rights and genocide and so on and so forth. Keith, you're absolutely right that Hoppe has had his fingerprints on much of the formation of the dissident right. There didn't appear to be forks in the road until there were later internal disagreements about just how far individual rights should go versus this whole balancing act between different axes of like individual rights and racial homogeneity, and just how authoritarian or libertarian of a society are we advocating for. So in this initial formation, yes, I think he was in the right place at the right time. I just think that there were these unavoidable internal conflicts that were coming down the pipe that Hoppe was really just forced to be a part of, and that of course created this division within the dissident right, alt-right. I guess I'll just leave with this. Our friend and colleague, Right Ruminations, could be right in the sense that the alt-right, whatever that currently means, will retract into more of a libertarian orientation due to sort of these persistent smear campaigns from the mainstream media and really the PR disaster at Charlottesville. It'll be interesting to see how, if that comes to fruition or not, but I think I'll leave it at that.
All right. This concludes our summary of the influence of the thought of Hans Hoppe. Thanks again, Terminal Philosophy, Swithun Dobson, Keith Preston. This is Todd Lewis, the Phrase of Poly podcast, signing off.